Hi, everyone. I'm Haley Hoffman Perry, founder and CEO of Dandy Day, and I am joined here by Tribe Dynamics, and we are going to be talking through the hashtags, the sustainability hashtags that are part of the sustainability report for Dandy Day, and we're just going to dive in a little bit more. So looking forward to the conversation, and thank you so much, Britt, for being here.
Hi, I'm Britt Starr. I am the EVP at Tribe Dynamics. I've been working at Tribe for about 6 years now, so definitely have been able to see not only the evolution of our business, but also the industry and how content and conversation has continued to evolve every day to really drive forward not only the brands and products that are succeeding today, but really the values and preferences of consumers and how they shape the world around us.
Perfect. Well, we really look forward to diving into this conversation, Britt. This is the second, I think, discussion that I've had with you, and it's going to be exciting.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
As a reminder, this particular talk is going to go along with the sustainability report. And it's really all about looking at the conversations around sustainability in the scope of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there are 17 different sustainable development goals really set by the United Nations, and that is the most harmonized view and perspective of sustainability. So what I did was I had Tribe Dynamics run some reports on different hashtags that were related. And it was about 20 different hashtags that y'all ran for us just to see what the conversations were in 2019 versus 2020, to see out of these 17 different pillars of sustainability and the different conversations associated, which were the most interesting and talked about among brands. But it's I think it's really interesting and important, because as we need to understand sustainability as the consumers are digesting and consuming that information and interpreting what's important to them. And so I really feel like EMV, like for so many other things, is such a good indicator of that.
I completely agree. I think it's a really good way to gauge not only the volume, but the character of the conversation and how it is shaping over time. I also think that because we are really measuring influencer content, I think it's a leading indicator for the overwhelming preferences that we're seeing from consumers. So it not only reflects the market, but I think really leans into what we can expect in the future. And so I think some of those trends that you asked about and are looking into are really interesting in terms of trajectory of the conversation. And for me, the headline I think here is really about this value set around sustainability, clean products, transparency, consumers really wanting and needing and expecting to be able to connect with brands and products that align with their value sets in a way that is not just marketing, in a way that is everything from product development to the way packaging is put together, to the the additional communities and causes that brands support and build. It's table stakes. I mean, it's absolutely expected, and we see that across the board, across multiple issues. But it's just been a really interesting topic for us to watch as well. And the data itself obviously is very specific in how it is providing examples of that broader conversation. But that was kind of the main takeaway for me, is that this conversation is growing in size and scale, but also in the diverse ways that people articulate it, right? There's not just one way that people talk about sustainability. There aren't catchphrases, if that's
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
fair way to say that. It's really just built into the conversation in a really organic way, that I think is, I think it's really good. It means consumers are expecting really high standards from the brands and products that they support.
As we were looking through the conversations of sustainability, it is overwhelming. It's an overwhelming
Mhm.
topic, because it can mean so many different things to whoever you're talking with or to. And that's really what drew me to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals,
Mhm.
because it's 193 nations that have identified and agreed upon. These are 16 different pillars, and the 17th pillar is partnerships. So really 17 pillars to be able to create a sustainable future. And sustainability looks like having a planet, having economic stability, um, for the future. And so I think as consumers, we all have a part in that conversation. And I didn't quite know what would come out of the data when we looked at these different hashtags, these 20 different hashtags.
Mhm.
And some of the clear leaders in the conversation was BIPOC,
Mhm.
and so Black, Indigenous people of color. And I think that's a new term to a lot of people, but that had definitely the most engagement, or that it was a 7,502% year over year change from 2019 to 2020. And it
Mhm.
really wasn't a conversation until June of, it's almost a year ago, right? Last year in 2020. So are you seeing this? I mean, I'm sure you are seeing this, but what, from your perspective, what do you think about that? And as far as brands talking about BIPOC and relating it back to sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a really interesting example because I think that, BIPOC brands have always been part of the community, have always been part of the conversation, but because of the increased attention through the social justice movements
Mhm.
that were really highlighted, and spotlight was shown on them throughout the events of 2020. We saw those conversations and communities really start to gain, for lack of a better term, kind of mass support
Mm.
in the way that people were galvanizing around specific terms, kind of sharing the stage, if you will, making sure that the space was created not just for the support of those brands, again, that were already, they were already in existence. They already had deep connections to the community, and they had communities of passionate fans and influencers
Mhm.
creating content and supporting the brands and products that they produced. So I
Yeah.
think it's really important to talk about the fact that this is not a new conversation. This is not a new community. This is not a new expectation, I think, by the community or consumers. But the way, consumers and influencers are talking about this community and the issues that have been highlighted, I think are really, again, kind of, we're seeing those galvanize, and that's, I
Mhm.
think, the traction that we've seen in the use of specific hashtags.
Mhm.
We've seen BIPOC brands really just explode in their growth and
Yeah.
accelerate growth this year. And that's been really exciting to see. Again, I think that the events of this year really allowed those brands that were doing really great things already to have exposure at a whole new level, and really tell their stories on a bigger stage and be supported by a increasingly large and diverse community. And so
Mhm.
we're seeing that continue. That trajectory is something that, again, for not for all brands, not for all BIPOC brands, but for BIPOC brands who, again, kind of fit they're making great products that people care about, that align with that shared value set that we're
Mhm.
talking about. Those are the brands that are really, there's staying power there in terms of the way
Yeah.
they're able to continue to grow and engage the communities around them. And I do think that's, to get back to your question, I think that's really where sustainability ties in, which is we're seeing a lot of similar trends across all brands, BIPOC owned and otherwise, around the types of products that consumers are really interested in today.
Okay.
And again, a lot of that comes down to authenticity, this value set around clean, transparency. Sustainability is a part of that conversation, but similar to our earlier conversation, it's not always talked about in the same way for all brands, all products, all creators. And so it comes back down to this expectation of consumers to get great products. They know where they came from, what's in them, how they were sourced, and ultimately come to market in a way that aligns with the identity and value set of each individual consumer. Because ultimately, we have the power now. Consumers have all the power now, which is pretty it's a big responsibility, but it's also a pretty dynamic and empowering shift.
That's great. And I think with the, as Dandy Day is really on the ingredient side, the supply chain aspect of it, focusing on transparency, renewable ingredients, clean ingredients, and really understanding all of that, we see that importance of having that information available and responding, as you're saying, as the consumers speak, what can we do to help fulfill the consumer's request of the brands? And so really for us at Dandy Day, looking at that increase in BIPOC and even dissecting some of these other questions, colorism is something that's really come up, and looking at chemical policy or the lack of chemical policy that is or is not in place to be able to protect communities of color. And so I think that's something that we're going to see a lot of next year that I'm sure we'll do some hashtag research on as these conversations start to unfold, and really being able to have those solutions in terms of ingredients as viable replacements for those hazardous chemicals of concern. And then as we were talking about this, I also thought, women owned was another hashtag that really had had some growth, as well as giving back. So women owned, let me see, that increase was a 44% increase. It's not as big as BIPOC. So the second increased hashtag was circular economy, and that had 186% increase, a 69% increase in EMV for conscious beauty. Women owned had 44% increase. And so looking at that, so there's a huge jump, right? But looking at 44% is still quite a bit. And so looking at these, thinking about the ones that really stand out, BIPOC, conscious beauty, women owned, there is a marginalized community that just for me, looking at the data, thinking, okay, I think people are now sharing their voice, feeling marginalized and speaking up, the consumers. That seems to be the consumers that are coming forward and letting their voices be heard. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. If you're seeing that with any of your.
Definitely. I think again, a good thing to keep in mind when looking at the data is that the hashtag data specifically is really, it's more of a signal or an indicator of broader conversations. And so I do think that you get some of that, the scale and prioritization when you look at the disparity between some of the top hashtags and then some of the others that are growing. But I do think that it's interesting to look at it from a directional standpoint and understand that even though the hashtag itself, is a singular indicator, the conversation around those topics, what it indicates is that the conversation around those topics increased in size scale.
Mhm.
So I do think there are broader conversations going on about these, and the way we use hashtags as consumers, but again, what we're measuring is really the way influencers are using these hashtags. Is it's a way to self-identify. It's a way to extend your support, and again,
Mhm.
connect to very visibly connect your value set and identity to your followers and fans, so that they can share in that
Mhm.
community that you're creating, and kind of the connections that keep you together. And so I think it is absolutely an intentional choice. Like, if
Mm.
this content has, very specifically identified itself as, for something, of something, that is somebody creating more context around their identity and how they see themselves, and how they want to build the community around them. So I do think it's incredibly intentional. I really love the fact that several of the hashtags that surfaced in terms of growth, or that stood out in terms of growth, were very community centric. I think that is
Mhm.
something that we've always seen in our data, is that really, as consumers, we follow influencers, for maybe a couple of reasons. One, because we're just really interested in what, say, a celebrity or somebody that's notable has to say. But more than that, it's because we, one, really want an authentic, credible third party
Mm.
source giving us information, right? This is like
Yeah.
not the brand talking. It's not an advertisement. It's very much an authentic recommendation, reviews, tutorials. That's
Mhm.
what, why the content that you think of when you think of influencer content springs to mind, because it is that informational exchange. But I think a huge reason, and what we're seeing, I think, increase in importance, is this idea of community,
Mhm.
and the conversation itself extending beyond product recommendations and into what makes these communities of fans and followers and influencers distinct.
Mm.
One interesting trend that we've seen throughout the year is that actually there's been a decrease in branded content from
Okay.
influencers. So influencers are choosing to talk about fewer brands. They're being more selective in the brands that they
Okay.
choose to support and create content about. And
Mhm.
we've seen that trend kind of mimic in the consumers as well. Consumers are following fewer influencers, being more
Mm.
selective about the influencers they choose to follow. And a lot of that has to do with really being intentional about the kinds of brands, products, and people
Mhm.
you are connecting with and
Mhm.
identifying with. And that's something that we saw accelerate in 2020, and I would absolutely say fits into the conversation today. Is these, again, this idea of community, and connecting to the way community is built through brands, products, and people, is absolutely driven by the conversation and value
Mhm.
set around these brands and products, and these communities, and the idea of sustainability, clean products, transparency, are some of the prominent themes that we saw throughout the year.
Yeah. That's really interesting, the idea of community and seeing that grow, in this monumental year where building community was so much harder.
Hmm.
And I think, having new ways to redefine what your community is and how you belong, um, and those connections that you do make. Um, I love how that's been reflected in social media and in earned media value. I think it's incredible.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, well, overall, again, when I sent out to Tribe Dynamics to comb through 20 different hashtags, sustainability was a hashtag that I had you guys look through, and that was one of the lower growing ones from earned media value. It was only 7%. And
Mhm.
so looking at that, what it told me, looking at these 20 different hashtags, the first one in growth, or the most growing one being BIPOC, and then the least growth was sustainability, was how very specific, and you touched on this, but how very specific these sustainability conversations are going, and the different ideas that people are more interested in, influencers are more interested in. Yeah, so upcycled was one, which fits into the circular economy, giving back, and zero waste. So now there were some interesting ones that had a decrease in EMV, and that was vegan and plastic free. So vegan had a 16% decrease, and plastic free had a 22% decrease. Do you have any thoughts on those two hashtags, and how brands, have shifted in their engagement? Brands, influencers might have shifted in their engagement.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I definitely think it's reflective of the broadening of the conversation. I think that, they're similar to sustainability. I think there are many different ways to have a conversation around cruelty-free, vegan, like the shared value set around some of those pillars. So I think that it's somewhat reflective of that. I also think that from a volume standpoint, hashtag sustainability, some of these like kind of core, more traditional ways to talk about or label the content that you're sharing, the values that you care about, are significantly higher in volume. While they're not growing at the same rate, the volume itself is the scale is significantly higher. I think we published a report this past month that talked about sustainability, the sustainability movement and hashtag, and it accounted for over $1 million in EMV for beauty brands specifically. I think that number triples for fashion brands, interestingly, which that was actually one interesting thing that stood out to me, is the volume of conversation around sustainability, specifically using the word sustainability for fashion brands, was almost 3 times that of the same kind of hashtag or verbiage being used for beauty brands and content. I'm not sure how to interpret that. I think potentially it reflects the importance of that conversation in that industry at this time, right? Like those 3 things kind of converging. It's a huge issue for the fashion industry, and something I think that is being tackled at all, in all ways. And in some ways, I feel like you would actually have really interesting perspective here, but in some ways I feel like beauty might be kind of a step ahead in that conversation, in terms of these expectations have really been set for beauty brands. Consumers have spoken, if you will. And really now it's about execution. Like, how are you living this every day? How are you changing your from your supply chain to product development to ingredient selection? How are you bringing new brands to market, and what are we seeing there? So that's a one woman opinion, but I'd be curious to see if you have some of the same thoughts there.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of fashion, when you look at the industries, the way that products are made are very different. When you look at fashion, you have a really heavy labor force that's engaged. And so you have ethical things to consider, like child labor and fair working conditions. Whereas when you have cosmetics, skincare, personal care products, a lot of that is machine automated. So I think our conversations are centered more around the sourcing and less around the manufacturing. So even though the manufacturing does have huge sustainability implications, the life cycle, from what I see on the ingredient side, is really life cycle analysis, looking how that particular ingredient is cultivated, whether it's through biotech, if it's from traditional agriculture, if it's through modification of fossil fuels, and how does it go back after it's being used. So clean beauty is really about the safety of a product for a person's health, for their personal health, and really reproductive health. That's really been the driver of the clean beauty conversation. And then when the product is finished, or if it rinses off of you, goes down into a drain, you go into an ocean, you throw your package away, then what does that end of life cycle look like for that product? And are there any adverse effects? So that's a little bit different than fashion. I can't speak to the whole fashion supply chain, but really the labor force is a huge area. I know that they've focused a lot of time. So that's why I think that's probably 3 times higher. And the use of chemicals and raw materials to be able to treat the fabrics, I think have been a big conversation. And it happens at a much larger scale too. So when you think about high impact, the scale of creating denim, it's the waste is, I think, is going to be a lot more than what you see for products that are, maybe this size. So I think the impact is higher, and that's probably why you have more conversations. So
yeah, that's really interesting. It's really interesting. Again, I think from a directional standpoint, the fact that these conversations exist and are, for the most part, growing in scale. Again, the terminology that we're using continues to evolve. And I actually think that is really interesting data for brands, even policymakers. Like, how do actual people talk about these things? Like, what are the words that we use all day, every day to talk about what we care about? What we're kind of gut checking for ourselves when we do explore new brands and products. And I think that oftentimes those two things don't marry together.
Right.
Two different sets of vocabularies are being used. And so I think looking at the conversation that's happening at scale online and understanding the vocabulary that's being created around conversations that are massive and complicated and complex is incredibly useful at all levels. Again, I think brands can learn a ton by kind of diving into the content itself and really understanding how consumers are talking about this today.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And really the sustainability report that Dandy Days put together is really doing that. We're taking these hashtags and then we line them up with what is the UN Sustainable Development Goal that it would fit under. So like BIPOC would be reduced inequalities, the circular economy, the circular economy fits under responsible consumption and production. Conscious beauty, we put that under the broader scope of sustainability. Women owned, again, would be reduced inequality. It's interesting, and I agree. The shared language and is so important, and that's why we've really focused the conversation on what is the broadest scope of sustainability. That is the UN SDGs. What are they? How do we continue to communicate about them so we have that shared language? And I think it's that shared language that really is able to fast track and scale the work of sustainability if we're all speaking the same language. So
absolutely, it's so important. I think the other piece that's really important that gets lost sometimes is the actual business impact that it can have. So the other side of our data that I think is really interesting is that not only are you seeing how these conversations are percolating and the vocabulary is kind of evolving and changing, but you also are able to understand the brands that are gaining the most traction and the micro segments that we're tracking that have seen the highest growth the fastest trajectory, especially over this past year, are well within these wheelhouses as well. So it's, BIPOC owned brand, it's clean, transparent brands, really making sure that all of these, again, values, if we're going to kind of come full circle, all of these values are not only reflected in kind of the content, but also they're reflected in the brands that are winning today. I mean, these are the brands that are taking share of voice and eventually share of market. And so I think that piece is really important too, it will drive impact for your business. Like if consumers care about this and we are putting our voices forward, it will play itself out in the form of business results.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, share of voice. I like that term. Share of voice, share of business. Is that what you said?
Yeah, share of market. So we've done a lot of research in the past, just to really understand the relationship between earned media value and kind of the share of voice, share of conversation, and the business performance of the brands and categories that we track, and where we really saw the kind of strongest correlations and most interesting insights is when it comes to a brand's ability to increase its share of voice relative to its competitors and category, and its future share of the market. So what basically, boiling it down, what we've seen is that if a brand's share of voice is increasing, it's very likely that brand is going to grow. If it's decreasing, it's pretty likely that brand is not going to grow in the near term.
Okay. Yeah. That I love that, being able to measure it, seeing the business impact. Well, and that's why earned media value exists. One of the reasons. So, well, I thank you so much, Britt, for sharing your insights and talking through these results with me. I have another question came to my mind. You mentioned clean beauty brands, you mentioned transparency, and we mentioned sustainability. So from your perspective, how are brands differentiating clean and transparent and sustainable, or is there a difference?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, comes back down to I think it's less about how brands are differentiating and more about how consumers are creating this vocabulary set. And so there is definitely overlap, I think, in the ways that consumers are using these terms and applying them to the products and brands that they buy. When we look at clean, transparent, brands like The Ordinary come up. So they're very ingredient forward and focused. CeraVe is another good example of a brand that's gaining traction right now that gets a lot of credit in those areas. Versed is another good example. So I definitely think it's a lot about transparency of ingredients. Accessibility, I think, is actually another common trait there, a little outside of the kind of vocabulary set we were talking about, but all of those brands are very intentionally accessible and affordable, high quality, but lower cost. That's another value that consumers really care about today. And then I think sustainability plays probably more into clean, but again, it's like it's a fuzzy word. Clean is a fuzzy word, and so I think that it's going to be very dependent on the ways content creators and consumers are using and applying those words, and less about the way brands are kind of terming or describing themselves.
Okay. Yeah. Well, in terms of clean fitting into sustainability, in the report we talk about it, where we really place it under the goal of good health and well-being. So we think that really encompasses that conversation of clean beauty in the whole framework of sustainability. We did see an increase, and there were a lot of brands that were talking about clean, but we didn't go into that as much since sustainability was the true focus. But we do have like a whole long section of clean leading into the sustainability conversation.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you'd like to share with us?
No, I
Mhm.
mean, I think I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's a really, again, complex and interesting topic. And I love the focus of the report on starting again to align some of these, incredibly ambitious goals and sets of values with the vocabulary that supports
Mhm.
them at all levels. I think that's work that's not always done and makes it a lot easier to digest really, really complex issues. And again, I would just really heavily encourage specifically brands to leverage the insane amount of content that is
Mhm.
being created around these topics to really understand how consumers are talking about this, are evolving the conversation over times, the questions they're asking,
Mhm.
because I do think in general we're seeing this move to very table stakes in terms of
Mhm.
expectations, and so understanding the nuance becomes more important as the baseline or standard is set, right? Then it's all about like
Yeah.
how do you continue to up the ante and really respond to the evolving needs of consumers.
That's a really good point. I think that is one of the reasons why indie brands have done so well. And really, the founders of indie brands, they really get their hands dirty. They understand the ingredients, they are formulating the products. And it's not as easy to just come in off the streets and just like, oh, I'm going to start a brand. Really, founders who are super invested in
Hmm.
every aspect and are passionate um, about what they're creating, and they have a real reason why they've created it, not just to make money, but it's to solve a problem, to be a solution to other people or to the world. And so I think that's exactly fits into to what you said of very clearly understanding how to be part of these conversations, that you have to be invested.
Hmm.
So
At all levels, and
mhm.
I would say I completely agree with what you're saying. I think in some ways it's easier than ever to start a brand, but it's harder than ever to start a brand successfully because
Yeah, yeah.
you are immediately exposed to feedback. And if you're not authentic and you don't, you know, practice what you preach, it fails from the beginning. And so I
Mhm.
think the you know the idea of accountability is the other piece here where consumers, and because of social media and the internet, that we have access to so much information, and so brands are really being held to account at increasingly high levels, and I think that means good things for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, thank you so much, Britt.